All right, we'll move on to our second speaker for today, who is Jon Symons. He's an associate professor at Macquarie University. I first met Jon about 5 years ago, talking about this book, Eco-Modernism, of which he is the author, Technology, Politics and the Climate Crisis. That was when I was with the Science Party, and we had an interview on this book in the very early days of the COVID-19 pandemic in this room, extremely socially distanced, just us and a couple of people managing the live stream. So it's great to talk to Jon again in this room with more people able to attend, to speak to us about abundance and the politics of our movement. Thank you, Jon.
Thanks so much, Andrea. That was a really, for me, very, that gave me insight as to where WePlanet is travelling at this time. So I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Every couple of years, it seems that Andrea and Tyrone ask me to come and speak to the WePlanet conference. And normally I say something fairly bleak about the prospects for eco-modernist type politics in Australia. And then a few years later, they forget about that and invite me again. So this year they asked me to talk about a recent article that I wrote on Marxism and eco-modernism, and how the eco-modernist politics is evolving. And I replied saying maybe it'd be more valuable to talk about I don't know whether people are familiar with the Ezra Klein, and I always forget the second author, Derek Thompson book, Abundance. But in the United States, in the last 6 months, this has been something of the central talking point on the Democrat side of politics, other than facing fascism. In Australia, it's been, according to a number of journalists, on the bedside table of almost every Labor minister. The Treasurer in particular has talked about its influence. Patrick Cummins wrote in The Guardian in July that it's days away from the start of the 48th Parliament, and if in Canberra there's one book that you must at least pretend to have read by then, it's Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. How does the book begin? It's sort of a science fiction Sunrise in America kind of opening vignette. You open your eyes at dawn and turn in the cool bed sheets. A few feet above your head, affixed to the top of the roof, a layer of solar panels blinks in the morning sun. Their power mixes with electricity pulled from several clean energy sources. Towering wind turbines to the east, small nuclear plants to the north, deep geothermal wells to the south. Now you can imagine a book whose opening paragraph sells the virtues of nuclear power might be slightly uncomfortable reading for members of our newly elected Labor Party. And the support for nuclear and for most of the politics that this group advances continues through the book. A few pages in, they write that by some accounts, nuclear power is safer than wind and cleaner than solar. It's inarguably safer than burning coal and petrol. And yet the US, facing a crisis of global warming, has almost stopped building nuclear power reactors and plants entirely. Between 1973 and 2004, the country started and finished only 3 new nuclear reactors. And it has shut down more nuclear plants than it's opened in most of our lifetimes. That is not a failure of the private market to take responsibility to bear risk, but of the federal government to properly weigh risk. And so the book is a meditation on how 1970s environmentalism and liberal restriction on the actions of the state has kind of ended the productivism, the production of the kind of goods that ordinary people need, which characterized, they think, the American economy in the 1960s. Why, asked Thompson and Klein, has California failed to complete a 500-mile high-speed rail system since 2008, while China has built more than 23,000 miles of high-speed rail in the same time period? Their central argument is that to have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. Less frequently billed as their central argument, but like an important theme of the book, is the argument that you need to have a program to harness technology in service of social change, and that the left's failure to have that program is a central factor explaining why we have this crisis of affordability today. Their focus is in particular on housing, which I think in both Australia and the United States is a generational massive inequality in terms of the access to affordable housing, but also health, transport, and energy. Now, although I've spoken about this book, whose politics is probably fairly close to WePlanet's, the abundance agenda in the United States has advocates from the socialist left and from the centrist Democrats, and also on the right of politics. Because I would argue, like eco-modernism, it's not a comprehensive political doctrine. The wider abundance agenda is united by an aspiration to escape from a political economy defined by artificial scarcity and to create a world in which we solve problems primarily by unlocking supply. Clines used the slogans supply side liberalism and a liberalism that builds, that whereas the left has often been focused on redistribution, it also needs to work out how governments can effectively deliver things and make things cheap, things that people need like housing and healthcare, make them cheaper by supplying more of them. And also, of course, clean energy. Zohran Mamdani, the probably likely next mayor of New York, has called for an abundance for the 99%, translating the ideas into, I guess, more social democratic or socialist terms. Among the diverse critiques that anyone who knows me might not be shocked to learn that I quite like of the book is that articulated by socialist eco-modernists Matt Huber, Lee Phillips, and Fred Stafford, writing in Jacobin. Now, I won't go into their argument in full, but I want to draw out one element of it, which I think is particularly important for this group and for my concerns that I'll come to in a minute about kind of where where WePlanet is likely to be successful and unsuccessful in Australia. So Huber, etc., diagnosed that one of the problems in American politics, explaining their failure to build housing, transport, clean energy, etc., is the way in which neoliberal era has empowered a new bureaucratic class, new bureaucratic organisations, NGOs, left liberal intellectuals, often academia, etc., who are no longer connected to, and this is a socialist critique, who are no longer connected to workers' movements. They are cut off from not only from workers themselves, but also from the tacit and formal knowledge that workers possess about how production actually functions. This is, for example, I'm quoting them, how a green climate NGO can believe that an electricity grid entirely dependent on variable renewable energy is viable, while any union member in the energy sector could quickly explain how such a system would fall apart. And then they point out that even Klein and Thompson, who by an Australian standard are very pro-nuclear, themselves are massively inappropriately over-optimistic about the decarbonisation job that can be done by wind and solar alone, and they argue that that's because they're liberal academics cut off from knowledge of actual material systems. Now, this reminds me of a couple of, my own experiences talking to Americans and talking to Australians, and it makes me implicitly worried about the prospects of pro-nuclear politics in Australia at this time. If you forgive a little bit of name dropping, I had the opportunity to talk about a year ago now to Saikat Chakraborty, AOC's, Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff, one of the architects of the Green New Deal in the United States, and now primarying Nancy Pelosi in a run for Congress. And his little organisation was talking to me about something different, but it wants the United States to go on basically a nuclear power build out equivalent to what Sweden did in the 1970s and 80s, which it seems extraordinary to me that if you think of who's the similarly placed people in Australian politics, it's basically the Green, as in like the radical left of the Australian politics takes such a radically different position. And I asked how it was that he'd come to this view, and his answer was, well, you know, I grew up with my dad working in a nuclear power plant, so I kind of always understood that it was clean and green and friendly to workers. And although I didn't talk about it for a while because the left was against, but he didn't say all these things, but I'm filling in some blanks here, but so it was kind of always very natural to me as people began to look at the climate crisis with more attention, that it would come, he knew that nuclear was an important tool in meeting human needs and addressing the climate change simultaneously. Now, this is where I get a little bit pessimistic, because I know a number of, I won't name them or place them, but people in senior left-wing positions in this country who have understood the value of nuclear to decarbonisation for a long period of time. And at the last election, all of them began to basically mock me for thinking, actually publicly I agree with them, that it's not very valuable to speak about nuclear at this point. Basically, the politics of it is so catastrophic in a context, if you're on the left, in a context where nuclear has become a central polarising issue in a federal election. At least for the next few years, the politics of nuclear in this country, I think, you look like something of a joke if you spend your time articulating for, arguing for it publicly. And the reason why I think it's so different is because, with a couple of exceptions, we have almost no, we don't have the submariners that they have in the United States. We don't have the people across the country working in existing nuclear power stations. So we don't have that embodied knowledge of workers arguing for the common sense character of this solution, which means that within our politics, I think you sideline yourself at the moment if you spend much of your time speaking about nuclear power. So, an optimistic note, a pessimistic note, and another optimistic note to draw about abundance. First, I think for WePlanet, this book and the movement around it gives a vocabulary and an intellectual touch point that speaks really powerfully to government in Australia at this time. The pessimistic point, though, is that WePlanet's great challenge is, if it is to become a more politically significant organisation, is to find members at scale or donors at scale. And for either of those things, you need to find emotionally significant issues where WePlanet's position is attractive and distinctive. Now, I was just chatting to a couple of people who I met, and why are they here? It tended to be because of the concern. Well, I'm not sure what motivates the veganism of the people I was chatting to a minute ago, but veganism or concern for animal agriculture is for a very small proportion of the population, is a emotionally resonant issue where WePlanet has a distinctive issue. So a distinctive position, not necessarily distinctive from the large animal welfare or vegan organisations, but distinctive from the other environmental organisations. And it's possible, I think, to mobilise a very thin group of people. Does this make sense? As in the same sense that the Greens really rocketed to power, or not to power, but they had a step change in their vote at the moment where Bob Brown stood up and critiqued the Labor Party for its support of John Howard's refugee policies. Basically, the issue of refugees was this moment where there was a point of distinction between the Greens and the Labor Party, where a significant number of Labor supporters thought, no, I cannot continue with the party that supports the indefinite detention of innocent people. And that was a kind of emotionally resonant issue that helped them step forward. I'm not sure how WePlanet, like, would you, would you challenge Adam Bant and the ACF to critique the meat industry? And they very subtly will critique the meat industry, but not in the scale or the vehemence which would be justified by the actual impact of animal agriculture on Australian greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, etc. So I'm just throwing out ideas here. I'm not sure whether that's an attractive one. But finding those kinds of emotionally resonant issues would be, I think, necessary for WePlanet to find a really significant place in Australia's political and NGO landscape. And I'm not at all convinced that that is possible. Certainly at this point, I think that the campaign around nuclear probably alienates more people than it. There's a very small overlapping Venn diagram of pro-nuclear vegans. They tend to be kind of hyper-rationalist people, and a lot of them are in this room, or maybe at least on the membership list of WePlanet. But it's not a one issue alienates the majority of Australia, and the other issue, as in the kind of animal welfare, vegan kind of position, alienates not just most people on the right, but most people. And the nuclear issue alienates almost everyone who sides with any of the major left-wing parties in this country. So that's a real challenge. But to wind up on a slightly more positive note, maybe, the positive story is that since the intellectual winds of the zeitgeist are at your back, your work of submissions to parliamentary committees, to submissions to the food regulator, to online trolling of green groups, or whatever it is that the work that WePlanet does, may actually be impactful. As in, these are arguments that are on the bedside table of the Treasurer. You're speaking to an audience which just needs to be taken a few steps forward. Does it make sense? On many issues. So maybe you don't need to be, as you know, maybe the work that you're doing now is in some senses enough. This is a intellectual community that is advancing intellectually defensible positions, even if they're not widely emotionally resonant. When it comes to energy, my suggestion would be that helping people one step along the way to the kinds of positions that you hold might be a more persuasive way of engaging with energy politics than making making nuclear central to your public image. I've heard today already talk of opposition, or maybe it was yesterday I went to, talk of opposition to grey hydrogen. We're going to hear later about the insanity of generating electricity from wood. These are issues where there's a tension between, so I guess most of our public talk about climate targets at the moment is based on different kinds of fantasies. And because of the polarized political environment, where you have one party who are somewhere caught up in climate denial and the other party who is sincerely trying to do quite a bit better, the political class has given a free ride to the Labor Party, I would argue. We are obviously not going to reach our 82% renewable energy by 2030 target, but you will not find that in mainstream press. The CSIRO just last week produced climate modelling built on figures which are 5 years out of date and assume that coal use had already dramatically fallen. So basically, the assumptions going into the modelling are based on a fantasy which is already inconsistent with our reality. Now, in these kinds of situations, focusing our attention on specific sharp questions might be the political work that brings people closer to a more pragmatic view of energy systems. For example, the CSIRO report, and I think any effort to reach our 2035 climate targets, are all built on the idea that there are going to be large-scale negative emissions. Those large-scale negative emissions, the more that we think about them, the closer it brings us to thinking pragmatically about energy systems. As in, are they going to be afforestation of agricultural land that will burn down in the next major fire? Not only is there rural opposition to that, but just a minute of thinking about it makes people see the futility of that kind of endeavour. Where that will bring people's minds, I don't know. One thing that I find particularly interesting is how in the UK at the moment, the Sizewell reactor that they're constructing is building carbon dioxide removal into the power station. it's very hard to think of how we're going to do large-scale carbon dioxide removal without beginning to think about industrial responses or industrial forms of carbon removal that currently are not in the Australian public's imagination. So I'm not sure whether that was a very crisp suggestion. I hope it made sense, but I think basically thinking of detailed, incremental points to put forward in the areas that are not obviously polarized is perhaps a better way of getting us towards the pragmatic reasoning than going first for the nuclear argument made in its abstract. I guess another element of that is it's incredible how little we hear the voices of anyone working in electricity grids in our national energy debates. A couple of times when I've had a chance to sit down with people working in that sector, I've got a good friend who's spent his life building the substations, and well, he's now working on interconnectors, but previously on connecting wind and solar to the grid at scale. And the federal government's targets are laughable to anyone working in that sector. The point that our socialist critics of abundance make about the embodied knowledge of workers being absent from our debate is really obviously true. So basically any moment where WePlanet can find a way to platform people with that kind of embodied knowledge will bring more pragmatic conversations about energy, I would argue, to the fore. I guess another interesting point, in the past, WePlanet has thought about housing, which is, I think, has done some work on housing. I think that's another emotionally resonant issue where an environmentalism like eco-modernism that embraces density and centralization as a technique of land sparing, has great capacity. So I'm not sure whether I have an optimistic note to end on, except that with the intellectual winds of the zeitgeist at your back, WePlanet, I think, can give itself a pat on the back for articulating this set of ideas sharply in an environment where I guess the success of the ideas might occur without the success of without the organisation itself becoming the size of Greenpeace. Thanks.
Well, thanks, John. I thought you said it wasn't going to be so bleak this time. We are coming up a lot. We'll put time for a couple of questions if anyone has any.
I wonder if a couple of things. Given that nuclear has gone so poorly in terms of an election for the Liberal Party, and they had such a thrashing from their voters, I'm wondering if you're actually better off running almost a negative or campaign on the downsides of the renewables and the shortfalls of the renewables, and just sort of chip away at renewables and how they're going to fail and not keep up with the growing energy needs. What do you think there?
It depends on the identity of the organisation. As in, if you want to appear on Sky News and in the pages of The Australian, that is a fantastic strategy. If you want to be taken seriously in the pages of The Guardian and the Sydney Morning Herald, or basically with everyone under 40, then that's not a good strategy. Because, well, first is that in my analysis, which is just derivative of others, renewables play a really major role in a least cost zero emissions grid. And so now they have all kinds of downsides as well. They're solar on rooftops and some solar that can be integrated with agriculture, not necessarily significant downsides, but the biodiversity impacts, land impacts, etc., are obviously significant. But I think you look well, to the left of politics and to the sensible mainstream, you look a bit crazy if you emphasise those points too much. And I'm not trying to say that, yeah.
You totally diss all the solar and wind and that sort of thing, but there are going to be downsides, and like I guess it's about getting people who already are strong believers in these technologies to shift their thinking a little bit, to be looking for alternatives, and then that's when the nuclear could come into the picture.
So on the right of politics, you're definitely right, but we just have this situation where, like, I routinely find, I don't know whether people in this room know Aidan Morrison. He's for the Centre for Independent Studies, he appears almost every week in the Australian and on Sky News. People whose job it is to work on energy have not heard of him. So you've sort of got to, and I mean, this organisation has hosted international visitors, and once they appear on Sky News, they cannot go on any of the. So we have this divided national conversation. That's a legitimate, like to speak to people who will hear that message is a legitimate strategy for some organisations. However, I'm not sure that an organisation where about half of this people in this room are, I think, are either vegan or interested in critiques of animal agriculture and the move. Now, those two audiences are not the same. Does it make sense? As in, if you're trying to speak to the audience who are open to understanding the case for nuclear by focusing on the downsides of renewable energy, they're going to think you're nuts if you talk about a critique of animal agriculture. So it's a really difficult line to straddle, I think.
I was just wondering, with the groups, the workers of the electricity grid and the system, would you be looking at maybe some Facebook groups to try and look at them?
Sorry, do you want to speak?
Yeah.
For the people.
I was just wondering, with the electricity grid groups, so we'd probably be looking at, obviously you've got the organisations that construct the grid, and then you've got the lesser organisation, but you've also got groups online. So maybe you would be looking at union groups and things like that, the worker groups that are constructing these systems, to sort of look at them and think about what they're saying online, and trying to obviously they'll be talking online about how the system's not going to work. What do you think about that? How could we what would if you're okay to say it, but what would be your strategy for that, to try and, obviously you'd be looking at Instagram, Facebook, all the social media platforms, following them, and then maybe, starting to sort of have a conversation with them?
It's I don't have the answer to your question. It's a difficult question, because, so a number of elements. One, workers will often find it hard to put their heads up and speak publicly. Like my good friend who works in this sector has been talking to me for a decade about this topic, but will never speak publicly because that would be against the interests of the business that he works for. Second, people are not thinking that we are going to necessarily have, like, basically, are we going to have a fully decarbonised variable or intermittent renewables-based grid? No, but that doesn't mean that the grid is going to fail. It means coal stations are going to, be around a bit longer. Gas is going to play a bigger role, etc. And there's a lot of, like, the corporations are maximising profits, and there's nothing wrong with the current environment from their perspective. So how to get credible people to speak
like
publicly,
whistleblowers,
who are, but they're not even whistleblowers, because it's not as though, as in, most people's job is not to analyze the entire system. Most people's job is to build this transmission line, to install this, whatever, you know.
Yep.
And there's no scandal. I mean, there are some scandals, but there's no scandal about any individual project. It's about whether that entire thing adds up. Now, we can all look at, like, you look at the graph that the Labor Party produced before it came to government, and we were supposed to be, I can't remember the number, but like at 56%, does anyone know? Like in the mid-50s, intermittent renewables by this point, and really we're in the low 40s. So we're falling far behind the timeline, and you can see, if you look at the data, what the carbon emissions of our electricity grid were supposed to be in 2025 when the Labor Party came to government, and we're about 50% higher. So anyone in this room can point to these things. What is missing, I guess, like if some weird academic says these things, no one cares. If someone who has the credibility of a lifetime working in the sector speaks, well, they're not going to get the voice isn't going to be heard in the major news outlets, but I just think they have a credibility which is missing from the economists and lobbyists who dominate the conversation at the moment. I don't know whether that, I don't have a good answer to your question. It's a challenge.
We might have to figure something out.
Yeah.
So just regarding nuclear, like I think like one of the challenges facing nuclear is that it is safe, but only if it is built and operated in a competent manner. And I think one of the problems is that I haven't heard discussed much, is that this relies on the public kind of having trust towards the corporations and the institutions that will be like building and operating nuclear plants. And unfortunately, kind of feels like public trust in these kind of institutions has really been falling, partly, for many reasons, partly due to like kind of failures that have been quite prominent in recent times, like for example, Boeing, stuffing up, a few airplanes, in recent times, or like the Fukushima disaster, probably many other reasons why there's an erosion in public trust. So I'm thinking like, how important do you think this issue is? And like, how do we go about increasing public trust in these sort of institutions?
I think it is a massively important question. If you look at where has built nuclear successfully historically, it's social democracies and, I'm not sure how to characterize them, but fairly authoritarian states, and sometimes high trust authoritarian states. I guess, so that's true. Well, no, that's broadly true. And in a declining trust environment where Panadol and vaccines are widely critiqued, then you've identified an important challenge, which I'm not going to resolve right now, but I agree.
Thank you so much, John, for your insights. We'd like to thank you again for coming. It's a small gift for you.
Thank you so much.